now, so I might give it just a moment more. All right. So again, thank you so much for everyone who has come here today. This is the Ethnographies Empire Cluster's first event. So I'm Jordana Matlon, co-founder and current co-lead with Grady Lovelace of the Ethnographies of Empire SIS Research Cluster at American University. Garrett and I are delighted to welcome you to our first Ethnographies of Empire event of the 21-22 academic year and our 5th year as a research cluster. The Ethnographies of Empire Research Cluster provides an intellectual space for SIS scholars who use ethnography, critical theory, and historical research to interrogate structures of domination rooted in contemporary iterations and legacies of empire. With the breadth of our disciplinary and regional expertise, we advance theories of how empire is reproduced and the knowledge-power relationship therein, how global inequalities along the lines of race, gender, class, nation, and more are perpetuated, and how empire's formations are contested in comparative and relational perspective. As ethnographers, we approach these topics from the bottom up, examining abstractions such as the state, governance, and nature-society relations in their concrete and messy realities, to offer important perspectives on topics in international relations, and to interrupt standard narratives within foreign policy circles. As ethnographers of empire, we are in continuous dialogue about the reflexive nature of the task before us, that of dismantling the imperial legacies of our institutions, disciplines, and their received epistemologies. Built into this endeavor is the insistence on the co-constitutedness of voice and representation. And with fuller representation arrives perspectives that have been dismissed, paradigms that have been negated, truths that have been silenced or erased. At its core, dismantling empires of knowledge is about producing better knowledge. And it is best achieved through the power of the collective. Collective knowledge production, yes, but also collective knowledge sharing and collective visibility. And so we at the Ethnographies of Empire are absolutely delighted and honored to host this conversation with the Transnational Black Women Scholars of African Politics Research Network. Great thanks to Robin Turner, Tiffany Willoughby-Herard, Tait, and Takia Harper Shipman for joining us today. And thanks also to Christiana Kastner, Kate Arion, and SIS Research for the behind the scenes work in making this event happen, and for everyone who has taken time from their schedules to be here. So I'd like to introduce the scholars briefly, and then I will hand the floor to Tait and the network. Okay. So Robin L. Turner is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Political Science and director of the Peace and Conflict Studies program at Butler University, and an honorary research associate of the Society Work and Politics Institute at the University of Witwatersrand. Her research focuses principally on how public policies shape rural political economies, influence identities, and affect people's behavior in Southern Africa. She has published on topics ranging from the politics of tradition, dispossession, property and nature tourism, and field research to decolonial pedagogy. Dr. Turner teaches courses that help students better understand the perspectives, experiences, and political strategies of historically marginalized people in Africa, the United States, and elsewhere in the world. Dr. Tiffany Willoughby-Herard, Associate Professor of African American Studies, University of California, Irvine, and Professor Extraordinarius, which is, I think, the best title I've ever come across, and the Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair at the University of South Africa, and the President of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, is a Black political scientist and poet who focuses on Black political thought and the material conditions of knowledge production, Black movements, South African historiography, Blackness and international relations, diaspora, third world feminisms, decolonizing theory, feminist pedagogy, Black and African feminisms and racial capitalism, gendered racisms, sexuality, and international relations. She is the author and co-editor of 3 books, including Waste of a White Skin, The Carnegie Corporation and the Racial Logic of White Vulnerability with University of California Press, and has co-edited numerous journal special issues. Dr. Willoughby-Herard has prioritized building intimate and vulnerable spaces for high-quality research by underrepresented people through crafting intentional, collaboratively led scholar activist formations. Dr. Kira Tait recently received her PhD from the Political Science Department at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and is currently a Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow at UC Irvine. Her research explores ordinary Black South Africans' perceptions of the law and how these perceptions impact their views of the desirability and appropriateness of appealing to courts in their struggles to access constitutionally guaranteed services like housing, healthcare, water, social security, and education. Her work has been funded by the US Fulbright Program, the National Science Foundation, and the UMass Graduate School. And finally, featuring Takia Harper Shipman, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College. She is the author of Rethinking Ownership of Development in Africa and has published in Third World Quarterly, the Journal of Asian and African Studies, and Philosophy and Global Affairs. Her current book project examines the political economy of reproduction and race in the US, Senegal, and Ghana. Thank you so much again for being here. And Kira Tait, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordana, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone for attending today. I will be, sharing our mission statement and really where this kind of network kind of arrived from. And so our mission is that we are creating an intentional space for research sharing, collaboration, and mentorship to support Black women scholars writing and working on African politics. And by women, we insist on creating a space for all people who identify as women regardless of the sex they were assigned at birth. We are committed to building a truly transnational network led by Black women based in Africa and those based elsewhere. The goal of the network is to identify and share like the challenges and distinct barriers that Black women face when researching, writing, and publishing on African politics with a mind towards a candid conversation and strategic thinking and research sharing that expands the resources, from all of us, right? The network will create and convene spaces to highlight the work of Black women scholars to foster this kind of collaborative spirit of research and engagement. Solidarity and egalitarianism are always at the center of the work that we do, and the network will center the principles of solidarity and egalitarianism and self-determination, self-defense, accountability in these and other projects that we go forward. And what really is at the heart of the mission is something that the 5 of us really encountered at various points of our career as Black women scholars studying African politics, right? The pre-doctoral experience, the postdoctoral experience, and the experience as, working academics. And we are committed to kind of undoing some of those challenges, not just for women based in the US, but also on the continent, and fusing all of our experience to make it better for Black women scholars studying African politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that mission. So for some historical context of the network, Tiffany? We have you on mute. Okay.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start by talking about the puzzle and doing our work together as Black women and what it means to put pressure on the concept Black and woman. And when I mean woman here, following as Kira described, we mean gender expansive persons and all persons who identify as women. And so I'll try to remember in the text to make sure each time I say the word women to also include gender expansive persons. The Transnational Black Women Scholars of African Politics Research Network was initiated at the March 2020 National Conference of Black Political Scientists, or NCOPS, meeting in Atlanta, when Kira Tait, Robin Turner, Tiffany Willoughby-Herard presented papers on post-apartheid evictions, housing policy, rural women's involvement in traditional leadership, and Pan-African scholar activism and praxis as a response to contemporary xenophobia in South Africa, at a panel entitled Considering, Challenging, and Navigating Wars on Blackness in Southern Africa. Takia Harper Shipman organized a panel on radical political economies that included research from Honduras by Kay Melker Hall, on Haiti by Mamira Duguay Prosper, and her own work on Ghana, intending to contribute to expanding the geographical scope of NCOPE scholars. As program chairs for the African politics subfield, Turner and Harper Shipman had empirical evidence with which to conclude that we had received a paucity of research papers in African politics or diasporic politics beyond the US at the otherwise inclusive NCOPE's conference. Coupled with the marginalization of Black women and gender expansive person scholarship on Africa at the mostly white fall 2019 American Political Science Association African Politics Conference Group meeting that some of us also attended, it was clear that we needed a more systematic way to raise the profile of research in African politics by Black women and gender expansive scholars. While scholarship on Africa and the diaspora is embedded in the mission of NCOPES and has an esteemed history in the organization, there's room for its further articulation and expansion. We continued talking after panels and attended sessions on the now 30-year-old Race and Democracy in the Americas project, and began to envision creating a sustained and inclusive network for Black women and gender expansive scholars of African politics. We see our research network as bridging broader networks of Black and African feminists, womanists, and African gender scholars, organizing movements, catalyzing political education, and using research to amplify vital contributions to the study of African politics within the context of the vision, longevity, and institutional dedication of the founders and leaders of NCOPES. As co-founders of this transnational network, we have each emerged in different scholarly generations and through a wide range of US-based ideological, political, and movement traditions. And yet, despite all of these differences, as Black women and gender expansive scholars, we share the painful, isolating, and wholly preventable experience of being underrepresented, tokenized, and regarded as having no antecedents. Such experience caused grave injury and reduced our potential numbers as formally trained Black women and gender expansive African politics scholars. Much of the work that we have shared together has involved opening up space for reflecting on the scholarly and scholarly activist genealogies that were key to our own training and those that were outside of mainstream white American political science, and to other genealogies that we wish to engage. Ultimately, we seek to take up the charge of what one of the co-founders of the African Heritage Studies Association and a former president of NCOPES, Dr. Shelby Lewis, explained in the 2014 through 2019 essay entitled African Politics Leadership in the Renewal Period, marking 50 years of the organization, the African Heritage Studies Association. Lewis explained the charge following. In addition to holding conferences, publishing book series, erecting scholarly canons, commissioning murals and curating art exhibits, catalyzing new research agendas, the tasks of renewal include, quote, documenting and explicating the global context in which slavery, colonialism, and imperialism emerged, converged, pillaged the African world, and interrupted its development, and examining the impact of historical forces that still resonate and continue to divide, destabilize, exploit, and shape relations within and between African peoples and the rest of the world, end quote. Lewis and the genealogy of African politics scholars that she emerges from have produced a vast literature. They have founded and funded institutions of higher education across the African continent and the Americas. They have founded and funded research partnerships that linked Black movement people across the globe into sustained scholarly networks that have produced us. And yet, their scholarship exists under erasure and is not available on syllabi and political science departments outside of historically Black colleges and universities around the world. As an autonomous and Black-led professional research association, the African Heritage Studies Association, quote, challenged conventional views of Africa, interrogated historical ideas of an underdeveloped, dependent, resource-poor continent in perpetual need of Western aid and tutelage, collaborated with other disciplinary associations, including holding joint conferences with NCOPES and the Black Studies Association, and mentored young scholars studying African history and culture. Such efforts ignited a proliferation of African-centered research and publications, the expansion of Black studies, the founding of Africana women's studies programs, and the development of curriculum materials on African history and culture for pre-collegiate school systems. I want to share a tiny piece of reflection that a group of this earlier generation of scholars shared at a panel on Ralph Bunche at the American Political Science Association last meeting. The key thinkers that come out of the NCOPE's kind of ecology and landscape include Pearl Robinson, Shelby Lewis, and May King, but they are not alone. Pearl Robinson shared a vivid memory during her presentation at the Tribute to Ralph Bunche panel at the American Political Science Association 2020 virtual conference. Pearl Robinson testified about the barriers to her being able to conduct path-breaking research in African politics. Paraphrasing her words as closely as possible here, she explained, quote, "Charles Hamilton and Elliot Skinner were her professors at Columbia University. At that time, you couldn't do African-American politics and African politics together because one was American politics and one was comparative. If she'd known that Ralph Bunche was doing both in the 1920s, I would not have had to petition. Bunche's career was very much like mine, and though I've been looking at him through the archives, I realize it is now a mind meld of sorts," end quote. Not only was Robinson denied access to an astonishingly well-known intellectual forebear and thinker that had already charted a path that she sought to go, but she was told that such a pathway was literally unthinkable. Ralph Bunche was well known enough to have been a president of the American Political Science Association in 1953, more than 2 decades before Pearl Robinson earned her doctorate in political science at Columbia. Pearl Robinson's experience of being denied access to Ralph Bunche was reiterated in her own training. Her articles and research were never on any syllabus for any course that any of us ever took in political science. Robinson was made to feel that she was prepared, that what she was prepared to do and the questions that she sought to ask were what philosopher Nahum Chandler has called, quote, "problems for thought itself." Robinson's memory of her graduate education echoes one that Shelby Lewis shared with us during an interview in December 23rd, 2019. Upon asking Shelby Lewis what took her and her siblings to Uganda and Tanganyika in 1963, she retold the story of a white woman anthropology professor that had discouraged her from studying in Africa during her master's program. Her professor told her that African Americans lacked the capacity to objectively study Africa in particular. Further, she was told that Africans do not like, admire, or welcome African Americans, erasing at least 2 centuries of well-documented intellectual and cultural exchange and intentional, deliberate, social and political and cultural collaboration. Lewis finishes the story by exclaiming that that conversation made it easy for her to leave that graduate program and to immediately begin searching out and applying for posts like the one that she and every single one of her siblings eventually took up with the British Teachers for East Africa program, thereby beginning 5 decades of research, including visiting nearly every country on the continent and raising her children there. Another key example, in my final one, from within the NCOPE's ecology is Howard University Emerita Professor May King. May King conducted and completed sustained and published research on the United Nations crisis in the Congo, Ghanaian nationalism, international relations of Nigeria, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, the Congressional Black Caucus, the National Council of Negro Women, the International Association of Black Professionals in International Affairs, and was the first African-American professional staffer to work at the American Political Science Association, an organization whose provenance and financial solvency relied on the acumen of the aforementioned Ralph Bunche having secured a building that the organization still operates out of today in Washington, D.C. Clearly, May King's body of research demonstrates that it is possible to conduct both African politics and African-American politics and diaspora politics in the life of one scholar, perhaps even from the mouth of one scholar. But beyond these esteemed things, Dr. May King is an incredibly humble and accessible mentor for junior scholars. actively engaged in the Association for the Study of Black Women in Politics, and having lent her name to one of their annual awards, she is always a voice for intellectual autonomy for Black people as thinkers. By studying the Black women and gender expansive people who people the intellectual history of African politics, not only is it possible to develop theory out of the global South, it is possible to develop theory out of the intentional choices of diaspora-based Black women and gender expansive scholars who are amplifying the voices in politics of African scholars to collaborate on equal footing. So in the name of Shelby Lewis and May King, in the name of Pearl Robinson and Oyeronke Oyewumi, of Sotsi Sekata, of Lynn Osam, of Amina Mama, of Achola Pala, and the thousands of others, we created a network for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany, for that very powerful and important context and those accounts as well. So I would actually like to open it up to you and followed by Robin and Kira to speak a little bit on your research agendas and what you're doing to deepen these important legacies.
Jordana, are we in a series here or are we?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So if you can speak briefly, maybe 5 to 7 minutes about your research agendas.
Yeah, sure. So the first book that I wrote, Waste of a White Skin, was published in 2015. And the work was trying to help me answer questions about the role of race in philanthropy and to try to uncover and investigate something that I found in the archives. I originally went to South Africa in 1999 for the first time with a sense of familiarity, having been raised by South African exiles. And so I went there trying to do union work. I was interested in the Vihan Commission and the formal process of decriminalizing unionization. And in the archives, as often happens, I came across something that I had not been familiar with before, although I had been familiar with from having been raised in another apartheid society. And that was the erasure of Black people as workers and having worker consciousness and being scripted as kind of ahistorical laborers or people who are just, they must pay service, right? They can't ever accumulate wealth, they can't ever produce wealth that they can capture for themselves, but they can produce it for the benefit of the extension of white life. So I came across an actual South African government agency called the Protectorate of White Labor that was in the process after the industrialization of Black workers of trying to bring in kind of a late developing sector of about 200,000 white workers from rural areas who were being displaced by the introduction of mass transit, railroads, and other kinds of infrastructure. And so what was mesmerizing was not that process of displacement of Black workforces, and it wasn't mesmerizing that white workers were placed ahead of and got higher wages than Black workers. What was mesmerizing to me was the historiography that suggested that Black workers had not been there first. That was the kind of problematic for me. And I wanted to know about the social relations of what it was like for those white workers, particularly given that a philanthropy that had been so invested, per the Murdahl study and so many other kinds of interventions in naming itself as the backbone of racial liberalism and racial progress. And that's not what I found. What I found was an organization that was heavily steeped in sponsoring racial hierarchy and disappearing Black people, and really teaching racial hierarchy to poor whites in all kinds of places outside of the US. They were deeply invested in it. So that puzzle captured me and took me in a direction that was quite different. But the reason why I said it echoed my own experience, because I had grown up in deindustrializing Detroit in the 70s and 80s and knew quite a lot about what it meant for white people to lose industrial work and to, in the public sphere, talk about themselves as like Black people, as the abject. The next project that I worked on from 2014, I worked with D. Marco and Abebe Zagaya, who's been a mentor of mine for the past 3 decades, on a book on feminist approaches to cultural studies in South Africa. And we bring together some movement people, activists, people who were former detainees, formerly banned persons, and also post-1994 era people to talk about the cultural indexes of democracy as opposed to the political indexes or legal or juridical indexes of democracy. And so that book came out in 2020. And I'm working on another single authored book project right now that addresses youth-led politics and the problematic of why post-2014, the Afros up, fists up protests and rows must fall and fees must fall were so caricatured and pathologized in these really gendered ways by party elites and by people in their parents' generation. And so the real intervention there, I think, is talking about the excessive and radical fringes of the anti-apartheid struggle that was really deeply anti-colonial and that knew, with 50 years of experience of African decolonization, they knew to anticipate a neo-colonial state. And so they used art and writing and other culture work forms, photography and dance, to be able to pass on to the next generation a more expansive sense of anti-colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Robin?
Okay, I'm gonna set a timer so I don't talk for too long. So thank you, Jordana and Garrett and the research cluster for this invitation, and also thanks to those of you who took the time to be here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of generally what I think about and work on, and then about sort of 3 aspects of my current research agenda. And so, as Dr. Maitland mentioned, I do sort of study and think about the perspectives and experiences of political strategies of people who are historically marginalized and who are still marginalized in Southern Africa. And then in my teaching, that includes Africa, but also thinks about the United States and other parts of the world. And this is not necessarily where the discipline of political science focuses its energy, right? Deep, rural, less powerful people is not quite the jam of most of political science. And so as I went through my training, I sort of did the fairly straightforward, conventional, positivist, comparative political science training, but then also looked beyond the discipline for tools and knowledge and perspectives for thinking more about people and placing them at the center of the work. And so growing out of some work I did on Makuleke, who were the first community to do a successful land restitution claim against a national park in South Africa, I became interested in really thinking about nature tourism and rural politics and political economy, because that community succeeded in the land claim, but the restrictions on land use essentially meant that they had to depend on tourism if they were going to use that land for development. And so that grew into a project that draws and focuses on 4 rural nature tourism destinations and surrounding localities in Botswana and in South Africa. And I aim to use nature tourism as a lens to really illuminate Southern African rural politics and political economy. And as with all of my work, this is very much historically grounded. And I don't think that we can explain the present without situating it in these histories of colonialism in which the encounter between African people and polities and European people and settler polities resulted in the creation of racial states that bifurcated the rural terrain and established different sorts of governance structures. And so that work has been drawn upon in a series of journal articles, and I continue to work on a book manuscript related to that. And I'll note, if you hear barks, I have a dog. So something is happening outside. That interest and work in rural communities in Botswana and South Africa led me to get really interested in the politics of tradition. And Luthuli and Nsebeza, Mahmoud Mamdani, many other scholars, I think, have appropriately critiqued what is far from traditional or customary state-recognized authorities for all of their failings. But that said, they continue to be a locus of decision-making, of collective action, and of struggle in Black rural areas. And many national governments, including those of South Africa and Botswana, seem to be pretty committed to continuing the recognition of those institutions. And so in thinking about that and in teaching around politics of gender and sexuality in Africa, that really led me to what I'm calling reworking tradition, but really thinking about women's involvement in and governance of traditional areas. Most traditional areas continue to be male-led and male-dominated, but in those sites where women are the state-recognized traditional leaders, I'm really interested in whether, both what their experiences are and what their perspectives are, but whether and how their governance might positively impact other women and girls and gender expansive people in rural areas. Right? And I've done field work on that. I've sort of worked in 3 different women-led communities in the Northwest province of South Africa. And then the pandemic happened, so I have not been able to return to the field, but hope to do so fairly soon. And the third and final thing I'll talk about has to do with really researching and thinking about research methods and praxis and the discipline of political science. Field research has pretty much been my primary means of generating data since 2001. And I'm really interested in how perceptions of researchers and our interactions, both with research participants, gatekeepers, and interlocutors, shape the data that we generate, and also in how scholarship by minoritized scholars like ourselves is received. And there's been work in this area largely by interpretivist, feminist, and Black women and other scholars of color. And a lot of it tends to think about embodiment, positionality, and reflexivity, along with research ethics. And I think those things are important, but my aim is to sort of push political scientists to take questions of power more seriously and how we think both about research praxis and then how the work of racialized and gendered scholars gets received. And so I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Kira.
Thank you. So my work, similar to Robin, is dedicated to really understanding and valuing the perspectives of ordinary people in the context in which I study, which right now is South Africa. And really where this work, my interest in this work came from is the fact that much of like work on public law or law and society and on institutions within political science are really either about the institutions themselves or these elite oriented research, but really what is missing and what is often the most important part are the perspectives, right, and the feelings about ordinary people and how they think about democratic institutions, right? It's not enough that you just drop institutions and they're just supposed to like do their job. Much of institutions' work comes from how people see them, interpret them, and whether they want to engage with them. So I conducted fieldwork with ordinary Black South Africans, from your like Uber drivers, your shack dwellers, teachers, street vendors, on how they think about socioeconomic rights specifically, but also the act and the possibility of going to court to solve socioeconomic problems. And what you end up finding with that research is many of them have denounced much of the promises of democracy in this 25-year period. Most of them don't believe that these democratic institutions serve much value due in part to the current age of political corruption in South Africa. And what you find with ordinary people is that they've opted to use non-state related strategies, perhaps self-help or mass protest, to get the things that they want, to little avail. And it's kind of interesting because some of the state institutions can be more helpful than these self-help strategies. And my research agenda now and going forward is really committed to investigating all the perspectives of what I call like perspectives from the periphery, is that within all communities, even the most marginalized, there are even more marginalized people within the marginalized group. And so my next research looks at African migrants who live in South Africa and how they see institutions that they're now governed by being migrants, but that they have limited access to on purpose by being denied access by state actors, and how they make sense of how do they solve problems in light of their present situation, but their past, coming from wherever they are, right? The institutions that they experience in, the Congo or Zimbabwe or Ethiopia, and how do they make sense of all of that? And what political actions do they choose to take? And if they don't choose to take any, why not, right? And so my goal is really to get to understand like what people think about all these institutions that political science tend to like heavily study, but like never really ask people what they think about them. So yeah.
Thank you, Pira. I was just teaching on that last week, actually. Robin, would you like to introduce? Takia, why don't you speak a little bit first about your work, and then you can talk, but then we'll have you speak about your new book. So I don't know if you can provide an overview, or if you would prefer actually to just speak all at once, if that would be more coherent for you.
It's completely up to you. I don't mind if I can just have the introduction and I guess begin with, I think we were going to do it the other way. I was going to talk a little bit about the new work, but then have the main conversation around like the stuff I've done prior to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you would prefer to speak a little bit first and then be introduced?
No, to be introduced, sorry, and then just kind of go forward.
All right, so Robin.
Okay, so I am thrilled to introduce Takia Harper Shipman. And I want to put this a little bit in context. One of the aims of our network is to amplify the scholarship of Black women and gender expansive scholars of African politics. And we know that the work of these scholars often gets lifted from but not cited, or minimized or disregarded, despite the critical interventions of many such scholars. And so to that end, in our March 2021 gathering, we built a celebrated, centered, and cited event into it that was really meant to sort of uplift and amplify the work of one scholar. And so Dr. Takia Harper Shipman is our celebrated, centered, and cited scholar for today. As Dr. Maitland said, Dr. Harper Shipman is the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College, which she came to in 2018 after a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon and earning a PhD at the University of Connecticut. And she's written or co-written several articles and book chapters, which include Wangari Maathai as a critique of the World Bank's contemporary development model, Creolizing development in post-colonial Africa, stripping away the body, prospects for reimagining race and international relations, and race and ethics in international relations. So I'm not going to elaborate too much on her first book, Rethinking Ownership of Development in Africa, or on her current project, Suturing Reproduction in the Nations, that she's going to speak to those. But I do want to say the first book made an important intervention in the political economy of development. And I think this current project is really going to do the same for development and population studies, both through the careful fieldwork and the integration of insights from critical political economy and African feminist perspectives. I think she's a rising star, and I look forward to her comments.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Robin. And thank you everyone for putting together this conversation, for the invitation to have us here to talk about the really important work we're doing as a network, and offering your platform for us to discuss so many important and I think underlooked aspects of being women and women of color in the discipline. I want to start by just kind of saying that there's so much about what this network represents and the work that we're doing that had I been a part of something like this while I was writing my dissertation, my first book probably would have been a very different book, right? And I think a lot of us can say that as much as we can look back in retrospect about what we were trying to do and the interventions we were trying to make, but the type of support that would have allowed us to imagine beyond the disciplinary boundaries of political science, which is quite frankly what's necessary for the types of questions that we're posing and the types of things that we're interested in, that a lot of us could have really fulfilled our kind of intellectual potential very quickly with a lot more support, right, when we were doing some of our early work. So I just want to say that as an introduction to the work I'm doing now, that so much of the project that I'm working on and the way in which it's framed is a result of the conversations that I have with my colleagues like Robin, Kira, and Tiffany, and the fact that this type of intellectual space exists today. So just as a kind of introduction to the project, I'll work backwards because quite frankly, the book project I'm working on now grows out of the first book and doing field work. So currently the project is tentatively titled Suturing Reproduction and Racial Capitalism. And I'm interested in understanding how strategies for national and global capitalist development are enacted through and challenged by Black women's reproduction. And then subsequently, and perhaps more importantly, the kind of counter strategies that Black women use to navigate and resist having their reproduction kind of sutured to capitalist development. And I'm interested in doing this by making these kind of, it is more of a methodological move as much as it is about geography, but looking across from Ghana to the US and then back to Senegal. And kind of the thinking behind that goes back to the really important work that already exists, especially in the US and in the Caribbean, around the way in which Black women's labor or Black women's reproduction was originally tied to the formations of capitalism through slavery, through the transatlantic slave trade. And it's in those discussions that the relationship between women's reproductive labor is clearly kind of linked to the need for the kind of national and international need for labor. And we see that in the work of like Jennifer Morgan, Rhoda Reddock, right, who talk about this intimate relationship and how the demands for whether or not African women would reproduce were contingent upon the access to labor, right? So either be prior to the end of the transatlantic slave trade and, you know, the cost of labor being tied to whether or not it was cheaper to import Africans or to encourage women to reproduce, you know, domestically. And so in reading that literature, one of the things that struck me was that it was often kind of disentangled from the way in which those processes existed on the continent as well under colonialism. And so I was interested kind of in having this movement back and forth across the Atlantic to kind of think about how the processes didn't just kind of stay in the Atlantic, right? And not just about Black women through the slave trade, but also thinking about, well, what were the machinations of reproduction as it was tethered to the economy that existed on the continent as well. And so part of the way in which this is unfolded today is under the guise of population development. And this kind of framework is dominant on the continent, especially in terms of how people think about reproductive health and family planning. And the kind of theories that dominate population development clearly and unapologetically link national development and global development to rates of contraception prevalence, right, and fertility rates in ways that are kind of constructed as apolitical, right, but also simultaneously shift or externalize the responsibility for national development and global development onto Black women's reproductive decisions. And so I look at this, again, in the Ghana, Senegal, and the US, and this other kind of move I'm attempting to make by bringing in the US as and holding it constant as a comparative analysis with Senegal and Ghana. Not to suggest that the US is more developed, and so it can't be compared to these West African countries, but like what happens when we situate the US, and especially looking at Black women's reproductive health in the US, right? It's like wholly underdeveloped. If we were to take those same theories that are applied to reproductive health, population development in West Africa, what happens when we bring the US into close examination, right? Is that it exposes all of these contradictions, but especially the relationship, the way in which part of what I want to explore in this project as well is how we can think about that relationship again between reproductive labor and capital from a framework of racial capitalism. And the work I'm trying to also do with this second project is kind of returning racial capitalism back to Africa, right? Because a lot of the dominant conversations exist around and within the conversations around racial capitalism exist in the US, right? The US is kind of taken up, especially in terms of empirical and historical and theoretical work, have really kind of come out of the US in recent decades. And while people have given a nod to its origins in South Africa, right, with the work of like Neville and Legasik and Hempson, one of the things that people also don't acknowledge is how even prior to South Africa, it was Kwame Nkrumah talked about racial capitalism and racialism in his work in 1972, Class and Race in Africa, the class struggle in Africa, right? So as early as 1972 is actually Kwame Nkrumah who first kind of uses this language. And so if we begin to kind of use racial capitalism as a unifying framework for thinking about what are the kind of contours of global capitalism, right, that are dictating or attempting to dictate how women reproduce and which bodies are worthy of existing, which bodies are more valuable by having never been born, which bodies contribute to surplus labor, right, which bodies are more valuable in their or by being drastically reduced, right? There are all of these kinds of discourses that using a lens of racial capitalism and applying that to the kind of population development conversations and family planning just kind of help, I think, expose and better place in their proper context. And in so doing, it also illustrates how these actions and these decisions that women make in Senegal, Ghana, and the US that are often read as short-sighted and antithetical to their reproductive health and setting the country back in terms of development, not meeting MDGs or SDGs because they're having too many children or not, et cetera, that we can then, using like third world feminist theorizing, especially as I'm drawing on like M. Jackie Alexander's autoerotic, especially to think about how we can reconceptualize these same actions as being counter-hegemonic strategies, right? These are forms of resistance that under a typical theory of population development or demography, or especially demographic dividend, would be, again, read as irrational, short-sighted, right? But when we when we think about them under this different kind of framework, we see them as actually anti-capital, right? Like they become these kind of anti-capitalistic strategies. So that's the current project that I'm working on now. And as I said before, it really grows out of the first book project on rethinking ownership of development in Burkina Faso and Kenya. That book was originally my dissertation. And I want to just use a quick anecdote from when I was in the field working on this book. So I was in Kenya working on the dissertation, and I was going to figure out how do government officials and NGOs think about this concept called ownership of development, right? That came from the OECD and was supposed to be this major shift in development thinking after post-structural adjustments in the early 2000s. And I was waiting for one of the civil servants in the Treasury to have an interview. And I was waiting outside of their office. And when they finally showed up for the interview, they opened up the door and there's all of this clutter and all of this stuff. We all know how government offices are. We've done field work in the Global South, right? So I happened to see on the wall this piece of paper that said, donors want governments in the driver's seat, but donors want to hold on to the roadmap. And I asked the civil servant, I said, what, did you put this here? Like, is this yours? I'm like, wow, this is so subversive. And she was like, oh, no, that was here when I got here. Like, I don't even know whose that is. So like, what do you want to talk about? And that I use that anecdote because it's so important for anchoring what this concept means and how it operates and why it's important that we think about ownership of development as more than just this kind of rhetorical shift that took place, at these high-level fora and in development, but thinking about it as a new paradigm, new development paradigm that has all of these kind of clandestine and pernicious components to it that work to keep the World Bank and IMF and multilateral, bilateral donors from taking up the same responsibility that they took up or the accountability that they had to take through the backlash of structural adjustments, right? And now kind of places them in position to no longer be held accountable for the same types of policies that they're encouraging and pushing African countries to adopt under the guise of ownership. So the project essentially tries to push back against the notion that one, there is no new paradigm. There is no new development paradigm. Everything is country specific. Everything is country led. Donors just kind of take a back seat and allow governments to operate in the ways that they see fit, and really illustrates using Kenya and Burkina Faso, doing an extensive amount of field work. So I collected over 75 interviews across both countries with civil society members, that community-based organizations, governments, donors from the World Bank to USAID, the UNFPA, right? So a broad range of donors, government officials across both countries, to really kind of understand and unpack how are people on the ground actually thinking about this concept of ownership, and not just how they're thinking about it, because it's our job not to just kind of articulate how people are thinking about it, but to put it into a discursive framework, right? So how people think about it also exists within the way in which it was intended to operate, right? The way in which the framework was designed to actually be implemented. in Kenya, and I'll just talk briefly about just some key things from both countries that I think are important to highlight. I'm not sure, how good are we on time? Good, okay, perfect. So going back to that example of Kenya, right? When one of the things that really struck me the first time during one of my first trips was how people would say, like, Kenyan government owns development. We tell donors what to do, right? They listen to us. And I was like, well, why do you say that? Where is that coming from? Because, I know that the World Bank designed the Kenyan poverty reduction strategy paper. I know that the World Bank and the IMF had to approve those poverty reduction strategy papers. I know that the Kenyan government was just chastised openly by donors because of like a issue that happened with like corruption and so that was really interesting to me, and it led me to think about, again, how is ownership supposed to operate, right? Less about what it says it does, but how is it supposed to operate? And one of the things I kind of began to notice, because I would also sit in on meetings between donors and government officials and things like that, was that the whole notion of ownership was also kind of an aspiration, right? So donors would tell the government, like, when you're ready to own development, right? You're not yet ready, and you're using words like governance, right? And which was a very vague term that is able to be used in any kind of context as it suited, donor needs. But also kind of this sense of like, well, donors also we're not calling them donors anymore. I'm kind of being a little, good by even saying donors, because we know they're supposed to be development partners now, right? There are no more donors and recipients, they're development partners, which was a shift that came under the guise of ownership, right? It's a part of this paradigm. But development partners would also say, like, we're not just financial, we're epistemic, right? And what I call epistemic aid. We offer technical expertise, right? That is our role. So we just kind of accompany you and support you with development expertise as governments make their decisions until they're able to really do it on their own. But in Kenya, this looked particularly paternalistic, right? So again, donors would say things like, the Kenyan government was like living beyond its means, or that if they didn't kind of implement certain policies, that the World Bank would say things like, we dictate whether or not you'll get investors, depending on how you behave around certain implementation of certain policies, et cetera. And so in Kenya, the power dynamic never fully shifted as much as the rhetoric did. And even at the level of civil society, one of the things that continuously came up, which is why the chapter is called Beggars Can't Be Choosers, is because that quote came directly from one of the civil society members who I was interviewing, who was talking about how the civil society members and NGOs can't hold donors accountable for anything, but donors can hold civil society and governments accountable for everything, right? And so what didn't come with this new paradigm was any kind of mechanism for holding donors accountable, right? In fact, one of the things I asked everyone across all of the interviews was, who is responsible when development policies fail? And the resounding answer, despite the presence of donors, despite the impact that everyone said donors had, was always government, right? Similarly, in Burkina Faso, I looked at this from the bottom up, right? So I was looking at community-based organizations and who, work within the same paradigm of owner, like they receive money from an NGO, who received money from donors, who received money, that was working within the national framework for the national strategy for Burkina Faso. And again, one of the things that I'll just talk about briefly was how the kind of donor priorities shaped the way in which the community-based organizations designed and thought about their projects, because they felt that they had to, if they wanted to continue to receive funding, then they had to adopt all of the programs and projects that that the donors and the government was giving them, which meant that a lot of times they had to find ways to navigate using the funding, right, being kind of reliant on donor funding, but also responding to the needs that the community articulated, which may not map onto what donor and government priorities were. And so this is an interesting finding because it's one of those things that we know within development literature, right? But actually being able to see what this looks like on the ground was something that was really important to me, not to just say that communities are kind of in some respects beholden to donors, but also thinking about, one, it's not always completely that they're controlled and manipulated by donors, but what are the strategies that the community-based organizations use to still respond to the people in their community and the kind of health needs that they had, even outside of donor priorities, if that makes sense. Lastly, I want to just kind of put this in its proper context, right? So it's important to think about how, as there's a call for ownership in this particular paradigm with all of these different tools and these discourses and these strategies that come from, you know, donors and high level forum, et cetera, that African governments have long been trying to actually own their own development, right? One, we can look at like the Lagos Plan of Action from 1980, which was a collective attempt to articulate an alternative vision, economic vision for the continent, right? In the lead up to structural adjustments. Within the Lagos Plan of Action, collectively government officials, members of civil society, got together and identified not just domestic level factors, but also global economic factors that were contributing to the underdevelopment of the continent. Subsequently, if we think about leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral, Thomas Sankara, right, who I talk about in the Burkina Faso chapter, who were all clearly articulating alternate visions of development based on their actual country context that were still kind of rooted in their local realities. And in a lot of respects, were also democratically rooted, right? And how these same political figures, through various types of violent tactics from the US, from European countries, were either pushed out of office or violently killed, right? For attempting to actually own development. But this focus also on political elites led me to, in thinking about how they were sustained through, they gained their legitimacy through democratic means a lot of times, also led me to think about, and I write about this in the, there's a special forum on the book in the Journal of Asian and African Studies, where scholars like Jean Kamaroff and Olufemi Taiwo read and respond to the book. And in that response, I also talk about how like there are these social movements as well on the continent that are reacting to this framework, right? That are reacting to this type of like extractive development in this anti-democratic development that's kind of come under this new ownership paradigm. And so also thinking about how everyday people outside of the state, right? Because the state is no longer operating from a democratic principle, right? It's in a lot of respects, responding and beholden to donors and to global capital. But people on the ground, through various social movements on the continent, have been contesting development in Africa, right? In ways that don't often get captured as anti-capitalist, right? And democratically rooted. So I think that's kind of the if I were to put a lot of my work together under some kind of umbrella, right, is to think about how, one, where accountability lies, right? Because there's so many ways in which we can think about who is, and a lot of these conversations essentially come down to this: who is responsible for underdeveloping Africa, right? Who is responsible for determining what is development? Who is responsible and who can be held accountable when things are, when I'll say just kind of don't go as planned, or when there's there are particular types of violences that are unnecessarily unfold as people are attempting to achieve development on the continent. And so my work is often trying to ascertain that and why certain groups and certain people are have the responsibility kind of shifted onto them, right? And that capital and these kind of larger processes and larger systems of disenfranchisement, dispossession, and oppression kind of easily operate with impunity to some degree.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. So illuminating, and what two incredibly, I mean, diverse projects, and both really important in their contributions. So thank you so much for sharing that, Takia. I would like to open this up now for a Q&A, so for audience participation. I don't know if internally we'd like to start with any questions, or if we, okay. Tiffany?
So Takia, I love how you just closed there about, you named Sankora and you talked about Nkrumah early on. And because of this suppression of, assassination, right, at the level of the state, and then erasure from the social science canon, right? Really, those names only hold on in Black studies, in some tiny places, in like more left-leaning historical departments and sociology departments. But by the 80s, those names are persona non grata. They're completely forgotten. And not just in the Americas, but on the African continent. The social sciences are so heavily following what happens in Europe and the US that those names are not taught there either. So those origins of racial capitalism, it's like you smuggle them in your suitcase from one place to the next. And you can't then say where it's coming from, because every time you articulate it as being from Africa or from some part of the Black world, it gets repressed. And the idea that people with the bodies that we have could have done actual field work and actual interviews and actually been in archives upsets the notion that we're supposed to be trapped in whatever racial territory that we live in, right? Like, how dare you be a person of Jamaican ancestry and be concerned with Venezuela? How dare you be a Black Canadian and think you have something to do with somebody in Portugal? Like, how do you think you have a right to use your passport and do something else and understand Blackness globally, while whiteness is constantly insisting about its global reach? So I appreciated hearing more about your work in this context. Thank you so much, Takia. I appreciate you very much.
Thank you so much. That's so important though, Tiffany, what you're saying, because it's true. I remember there was an instance when during my PhD where someone told me, it's one of my white classmates, and they were like, well, I mean, so I assume of course you do Black politics, right? Like, clearly if you're here. And I was like, no, I don't actually. I do comparative politics and international relations. And then they said like, well, but it's about race, I'm sure. And there was something about that moment that in being transparent, I was so conflicted, right? I was conflicted about whether or not me doing race was too subjective, right? Like, is it a problem that I'm doing race and that he can pinpoint because I'm Black, I'm doing race? But then also simultaneously, I knew from, of course, because I went to Howard in undergrad, right? It was like, what do you even mean by race? Like, this assumes that you actually have a fundamental grasp on what race is, because it's not just phenotype, right? If we're using race and we're thinking about racial capital, then it is a material component as well, right? There's more to race than just this kind of subjective, if you're Black, you're looking at phenotype and melanin. But to that point, it's true. Like, how dare I be saying, like, not do Black politics, but then when you are to suggest, well, if you're doing race, there's something not rigorous, right, about the way in which you do race. There's something not and I don't even aspire to objectivity, right? Because I think that that in and of itself is a problematic aspiration, right? Because we all have subjective positions, and the point is to be reflexive about it, right? That's the goal. Du Bois talks about this as well, right? And at the end of the Philadelphia Negro, and in the work that he does, is that that is the aspiration of the humanistic social science, right? So I don't know, that just brought up that, you know, experience for me, Tiffany, and what you were saying, but I completely agree.
These are instruments of power, right? I mean, dismissing or parochializing race is dismissing empire and the status quo, the current world order, right? I mean, my question now is, and what are you doing if you're not doing race? You know, and gender.
But you are, right? You are doing race and gender. You're just not acknowledging how that's what you're doing, because we're all doing
or there's a huge absence if you're, you know, or you're perpetuating it, right? If you're not doing it, you're perpetuating it, and then erasing it along the way. You're an agent, right? Yeah. Would anybody else internally, or Garrett, would you like to ask a question?
So much gratitude. I've been taking lots of notes and learning, and just the depths of the systemic erasure that Professor Willoughby-Herard and Professor Turner and others have laid out it's as if these disciplines are founded on a white appropriation of Black, female, and gender expansive labor, and then the erasure of. And so the unpacking and the dismantling and the unlearning is so deep and yet so disincentivized on all these methodological and pedagogical levels, which makes this network so powerful and so pivotal. So much gratitude. And then just another quick thing about this donor class. Professor Harper Shipman was just talking about this is bigger than the Roman Empire. The Gates Foundation is bigger than the British Empire, you know, just in terms of like how much unaccountability, how much power. And so the racial capitalist lens is so urgent and on the continent of Africa and beyond. So this particular deep dive into analysis of the power relations and racial capitalism of development is has implications for way beyond the discipline of political science and academia at large. So much gratitude for that particular work.
We do have a question from the audience, and I would like to invite audience members to also enter your questions in the Q&A, but I'll start with the one that we have. So it's from Meredith, and the question is for Takia. Did part of your research for your book involve getting firsthand perspectives from mothers in Ghana, the US, and Senegal?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I couldn't do the work that I do without getting the perspectives from people themselves. So in the US, I interviewed mothers and members of the kind of reproductive justice movement in Georgia and in North Carolina, which is where I'm kind of focusing it since the US is so broad. And I also talked with state politicians. But one of the things I'm doing in the chapter on the US is following especially these two families that have Black women and who in marriages who have more than 5 children, right? And illustrating how like their decisions to have, as Black women, to have multiple children, and it really kind of embedded in them challenging the state and capital. But even outside of that, like I also have a survey that is ongoing with Black women across, just targeting specifically Black women, Black mothers across both states as well. Same in Ghana. I interviewed women at the, who were in the health service, who went to like Planned Parenthood, and mothers outside, and young women who were at the University of, or the Kwame Nkrumah University of Technology in Kumasi. In Senegal, I held focus groups with women. So I use like focus group method, the method of focus groups. I did interviews with mothers in Senegal, as well as like NGOs and government officials, et cetera. So I absolutely spoke to women, and that's how I actually derived those notions of like the strategies come directly from those interviews and looking at what women were doing, right, and trying to add some kind of discursive element to it.
Thank you. So we have a couple comments, actually several comments, and I'm going to save the comments. And can you see the Q&A? Can everyone on the panel? Okay, but I'll go to the question first. And then if we have time at the end, I'll read the comments maybe out loud. So we have a question from Sally. That's, can you all talk a bit more about the reemergence of racial capitalism as a framework and perceptions of how this concept applies in the contemporary context of South Africa / the US in similar or even different ways? And so this is a broad question for everyone, all the panelists. I could talk about it too, but it's not my.
Well,
you're speaking my language.
I'll start if that's okay. And people can piggyback because I actually developed my definition of racial capitalism by drawing on the work that's coming out of the US and Africa collectively, right, to get at a definition that I think will allow me to kind of traverse both of those spaces, right? And so I'll say that a lot of what's kind of coming out of the US and at this particular time, although the version that people are using that comes from Cedric Robinson, is like racialism is not supposed to be tied to phenotype, right? He's talking about, racialism as this kind of process of othering and then placing within a hierarchy, and then that hierarchy mapping onto material and social and political resources, right? You have scholars who kind of take that framework, but then still are looking at it in the context of the US and this kind of Black and white kind of juxtaposition. This is a little bit of this is actually what we talk about in the forum that I just put out in international studies about stripping away the body, right? Is what does it look like when we actually think about race in this framework of racial capitalism, and we're not looking at this white other kind of context. But a lot of what's coming out of the US is looking at this over time, and a lot of that work has also been historical. So there's the recent book with Destin Jenkins, and I'm forgetting the other author, but the Histories of Racial Capitalism, this edited volume that just kind of came out, where they're looking at it historically. There's also similarly the work of like Sharice Burden-Stelly, who again is kind of looking at it historically in the US. So those are primarily the ways in which it's being discussed here. And on the continent, again, the work from South Africa, there are South African experts here, so they'll catch you all up to that. But from what I understand is that it's not as prominent in terms of the continent anymore, in terms of how people are thinking about or talking about racial capitalism. In fact, one prominent African scholar once said to me, because I asked this in a question like about racial capitalism, and they were like, that's not a thing in Africa. Like, that's not what we're talking about. And I thought that was, like completely missing how the origins kind of started there. So if I can just kind of quickly read my own definition and the people I'm drawing on. So I'm drawing on Cedric Robinson, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Kwame Nkrumah, Oliver Cromwell Cox, Martin Legassick, and David Hempson. And I define it as the process whereby people are racialized into populations based on a metric of labor utility and expendability that translates to social worth and differential exposure to death, absorption of risk, and quality of life that correspond with the exigencies of national and global capital.
Takia, thanks for that very detailed definition. I think what I want to talk about is intramural class politics and also a kind of tokenism. And also, I guess, also anti-radicalism and anti-leftism. And again, this is kind of an intramural conversation. So please, I beg everyone's forgiveness for having this public conversation that's really should be an intramural one. And what I mean by that, maybe I'll start with the kind of anti-radicalism and anti-leftism conversation. There are deep scars within Black intellectual communities. And so names like Cox and Padmore and Robinson don't get always spoken or taught, even in Black studies spaces. You know, people lost careers, people got lynched, you know, people's lives were very violently upended for participating in left movements, for participating in radical movements. A lot of people got just disappeared. They got just disappeared. And so the names that you just called on, Takia, are not names that are the common names. And because Robinson passed, you know, a few years ago, and because his surviving spouse, Elizabeth, worked really hard to get a re-release of his materials, there's been kind of an upswing. But if I can talk about the workmanly type character of a person like Robinson, he produced over 300 PhD students in all different kinds of fields. And that's about taking on the labor of teaching people. That's about making sure that people, whether they're placed in academia or not in academia, still have access to publishing and still have an intellectual community to be part of. And so for me, the proof is always in the pudding. There is a profound class politics within Black communities that really doesn't want to hear all the time from Black people who are really seriously about working class consciousness and about egalitarianism. You know, the Robinson household to this day, they don't lock their doors. And for me, that really means something. It's indicative of a certain set of practices, around what it means to live in the world and to be accessible and to not be obsessed with accumulation of Black middle classness. And that is, you know, again, it's a very private conversation to have in this public forum. But I am always incredibly skeptical of East Coast, West Coast divides. Like, I'm not selling CDs out of the trunk of my car. I'm not interested in like what they're doing in University of California versus what they're doing at University of Chicago. I think that's a really strange game to play. I'm interested in us all reading those Black left thinkers. I just want us to be able to read them and then decide for our generation what they mean, not to be in any kind of competition. I think it's silly and it doesn't behoove us. So let me sound like Dorothy Height or somebody. We're better than this. So that's my response to what racial capitalism is today. And we really need to get clear about it, because in about 2 years, all the books will be published by non-Black people. And we'll be like, how did that happen? So.
In terms of like how this concept and where we see it in contemporary South Africa, when amongst ordinary people, there is a reemergence against racial capitalism, right? And I think the further we get, I think the further South Africans get from that democracy moment, which was supposed to be a complete watershed where people expected a fundamental systematic change on all aspects of life. And the fact that that's not materializing, I think people are more, and I don't want to use the word woke, but people are more, you know, they're realizing that the structure that they were given was not meant for them, right? And the more marginalization happens within the majority population, people are getting frustrated. There is a lot of talk now amongst people about Nelson Mandela being a sellout, right? There is a lot of talk about the broader ANC party being sellouts, right? And there is a memorializing of Chris Hani and what he was envisioning in terms of fundamentally like kind of changing South Africa economics and really fully and truthfully incorporating and inclusivity in terms of how Black people fit into the economy of post-apartheid South Africa. I don't know.
Part of the book is actually saying exactly that point. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for that added depth. This has just been such a delight having you here, listening to your knowledge. And I'm excited to have learned more about your scholarship. And it is shameful that I didn't know more about your scholarship until now. And I suspect that some of you are part sociologists, I will say.
Also, a quick shout out, there was a PDF that you all were able to curate and compile and circulate, which is just like so extraordinarily valuable, particularly in light of the systemic erasure and racist erasures. And so I just wanted to, everyone who's still here in attendees and for the recording, we're going to circulate that again and build upon it and keep listening to the network as they keep developing and expanding it, because that's the core of, you know, what the youth need to know and what we all need to be working with and learning from. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This was amazing.
So in terms of how to keep kind of learning from the network and following your all's conversation and public work and dialogue, how can we keep learning and staying abreast?
So I'll have to look for it, but we do have a Gmail now that people could let us know if they want to hear about things that are happening. Kira, do you have access to it offhand? I closed my windows. So
I can look for it really quickly.
Robin, while Kira is looking for that, can I talk at all about or invite Takia to talk about the conference she has in mind? Or do you want to share about the stream at NCOPES of papers?
Sorry, can you say that again, Tiffany? It was hard to hear you.
Oh, sorry. I was just asking Robin, I just was trying to be attentive to protocol about the conference that you had in planning, thinking. I don't know if you want to share it now or not. You were talking about a continent-based conference, and Robin is curating the 2 streams actually in the NCOPES conference that's coming up in March. So I didn't know if maybe people want to just share that. If you don't, it's fine.
I can quickly say so the NCOPES thing is sooner. The next annual meeting of NCOPES, I think, is in March 2022. And within African and African diaspora studies, we put out a call for panels, paper sessions, et cetera, that would be aligned with the theme and the mission of the network. And so that might be someone organizing something around a scholar they want to celebrate, center, and cite. It could be engaging questions, et cetera. And then I think Takia can speak about this, but the conference on the continent would be a little further in the future.
Yeah, and so that one's still kind of in planning because it's contingent upon like some, external things. But the goal is to have a conference that's based on the continent. So in between at the University of Ghana in 2023. Yeah, it's 23. I don't, every year is 2020 still to me. So that's the goal, and it'll be an international conference. It'll be virtual and in person, in a collaboration between the network, the University of Ghana, and then Sheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar.
I was able to find it, but I don't see a chat function for me to drop the email address.
I think we might have to just put it in Q&A.
Oh, is that possible?
And we can circulate it out when we send a follow-up email to everyone who registered. Thank you, Kara.
You're welcome.
So Kira is responding to the last of the questions.
I think that's where I tried to drop the.
And so now it would be under answered. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, if you look under answer, the last question responding to Bartolo is the email. And I think with that, I've kept you almost 10 minutes over. Thank you so very much for everyone who stuck around. Thank you especially to the network again for this. This was really, really wonderful. What a fantastic way to get us going this year. And I'm hoping and looking forward to many future engagements, both personally and through Ethnographies of Empire.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Be well, everyone. So much gratitude and respect, solidarity.